I just want to say a few things about the actual meaning of democracy historically in the West, from Athens to the present, if I may, or even pre-Athenian democracy, what we now call assembly democracy, with indigenous people going back thousands of years. And the word is made up of two Greek terms, demos and kratos. Demos means, of course, the people who come together and govern themselves, and kratos actually means power. So what they put together is a democracy is a form of self-government in which the people themselves exercise power. They reason together, they exercise power together, they agree together, they disagree together, they find ways of resolving disputes, maybe they revise their opinion a month later. They learn to exercise all the powers of self-government themselves. It's not a representative system at all, so hence the term democracy, demos plus kratos. They are really governing themselves, self-organizing and self-governing. And so this was a very special form of government, even in Athens. And the Athenian theorists of democracy contrasted it with other forms of government where some segment of the population rules over the other, like monarchy, oligarchy. And here they're using the word, instead of kratos, power, they use the word archai, which means rule. So it's the contrast with democracy is forms of rule where one segment of the population rules over the others, whether that's a minority or a majority or a representative system like we have in the modern world. These are all not democratic in the original sense of the term, because it's not we, the people, who exercise power, but we, through elections, pass it on to our representatives, and they rule over us. So you have a system that's really, from the meaning of the term, it's anti-democratic. So what happens in the 17th and 18th century and early 19th century, a really interesting transformation of the language of democracy. What the modern European states, the problem they had was the problem of scale. And so they invented the concept of representation, and it became the primary political concept in the 18th and 19th century. And Thomas Paine famously said, what we have to do is find a way to graft representation onto democracy. And so he invented this term, representative democracy. But what happened was it didn't graft onto direct or participatory democracy, but it left participatory democracy behind and turned around, and for the first time in European languages, called representative government, representative democracy. And that's what we've inherited from that huge linguistic transformation. The transformation was really taken place from Tom Paine in the late 18th century down through the early 19th century with Benjamin Constant, the founder of modern liberalism, and so on, and people walking through this transformation. And there's a nice side note to this in the latter half of the 19th century, where Peter Kropotkin, the author of Mutual Aid, was still using the word democracy, and whenever he mentioned it, everybody said, oh, you're talking about representative government. And he said, no, I'm talking about direct participatory democracy. But the word democracy had been so tightly now tied to representation that people didn't really understand then, what's this participatory democracy? So he wrote a famous article in the Encyclopedia Britannica, just trying to define what he meant by self-government. And he said, I'll no longer use the term democracy, I'll use the word anarchism. An meaning no, arche, right? He's gone back to the Greeks and got it just right. Anarchy just means not that we don't govern ourselves, we govern ourselves, but we don't allow the differentiation of society into those who rule and those who are ruled. everybody engages in the practices of self-government. So there was an interesting move. So what happened to participatory democracy? It came to be seen as one form of anarchy, one form of non-ruler ruled. Hannah Arendt's very good on the history of this concept. But the takeaway from it for me is that in direct democracy, where we all govern each other, we learn through practice, we develop this skill set of how to deal with agreements and disagreements, conflict resolution, how to reason together, to disagree, to have disputes and conflicts, but also how to resolve them. And Mary Wollstonecraft, who's kind of the first generation of European feminists in the modern world, said this has to begin in childcare. This has to begin in early schools. We have to learn how to be self-governing citizens of our little communities. And she said boys and girls in school should be thrown together and taught how to organize their own classes and so on, to learn these skills of living with, reasoning with, being free with each other. It's a whole different way of thinking about human freedom that comes into being when we actually begin to share interdependent relations of self-government with each other as equals, and only move ahead when we're all in agreement on how to move ahead. So we become the author of the relations we inhabit, become free in this interdependent sense of being free with each other as democrats, refusing to coerce one another, refusing to exercise power over others, refusing to make this distinction, this move from demos and kratos to demos and archai. And the takeaway for us, and I think for a lot of sociologists and so on, is that you can only have a healthy representative government if it's grounded in participatory democracy at the local level, where the citizens themselves have the practices of entering into democratic modes of organization in the workplace and so on. Across society, you grow up being a democratic citizen in the sense that you actually exercise self-governing power with your fellow citizens in all areas of life, whether it's in the family, setting disputes, right through to the workplace and so on. And so this is a movement that's been lost, but it's a necessary condition of healthy representatives, because then when I think, who should I vote for? I have the skill set of being a self-governing agent with others. So I'm thinking of who looks after the common good here, or sustaining this way of life, or looking after the environment, because I've had experience of it at the local level from grade 1 on, if you see what I mean. And same thing happens when I go to work or go to the university. Students have a say in what we're going to read in this course and so on. That we grow up being democratic citizens in this direct sense. And that, to use the ecological metaphor, it's a kind of permaculture of democratic ethos that then you're very good at deciding what the best representatives are that go to some larger body insofar as we need it. So the takeaway is you can only have healthy representative government if you have a population that is already a population of democratic citizens, a local level. I mean, this was the basic thesis of Tocqueville in Democracy in America when he visited the States and then went back to France and said, here, something special is going on in New England and this is how it works. And it was a kind of last holdout of that linking together of participatory democracy with more formal modes of representation. But what's happened in the modern world is representative governments have been subordinate to a set of economic processes, military processes, educational processes that are not based in self-government at the local level, but are in very unequal relations of power over and under in the workplace in our military establishments, in the competitiveness of fighting for high grades and so on, in our universities, we no longer have this skill set, because the form of power we know is power over others, being either over them or under it. Anywhere where you ask somebody where they work, everybody says, well, who's the one over, right? We just take it for granted that the form of organization is power over power under. It's anti-democratic. So we call these modern societies democratic, but from a Greek point of view, they're not democratic at all. They're radically unequal, and they're dictatorial or ruler-ruled based in all the major relationships that we live in and are habituated into. So what's happened in the modern world is a realization that the reason our representative governments become competitive struggles for power and have populisms of the left and right, and then the liberal, neoliberals trying to hang on, really when it's capitalist or communist or Russian oligarchies, it's the same way of thinking about things. How do we gain some kind of power so we can impose it over others? That kind of deterioration of participatory democracy, the response has been to say, well, we have to rebuild locally and globally a permaculture of participatory democracy if we want to solve the major problems today that are caused by the complete, almost complete absorption of areas of life into power over relationships of ruler-ruled of various kinds, the governed and the governors. And so what's happening today, Paul Hawken calls it blessed unrest, the greatest movement on the planet, and something you, Pablo, have written about, is just the reemergence of participatory democracy around the world in local organizations and then in networks among local organizations. And that's the great struggle today, whether it's against populism or it's against climate change, the meta change that's going to make possible the transformation of these vicious social systems that representative governments are subordinate to, is the growth of participatory democracy at the local level. And Pablo and I both admire the work of Boaventura de Sousa Santos, who has done a lot to begin to network pockets of self-government around the world, whether it's food sovereignty or indigenous people or people working on climate change at the local level. Over 1 billion people on the planet today are taking this turn. And so it's not simply, there's not a problem of scale, because it's the amazing fact that people are being the change themselves by just engaging in, educating themselves and other in local democratic practices, and then scaling them out. In a network age, it's possible to do. So if you look at the most successful movements on the planet, they're not directly interested in seizing state power or international power and so on. They're actually looking to expand power with organizations, or democratic in this participatory sense, in their local communities, and just scale them out. And in fact, they're remarkably successful.